Hello, fellow entrepreneurs. This is James Stalker. I'm an entrepreneur of high-tech businesses for the last almost 20 years. My entrepreneurial journey began in 2002 when I was still a staff member at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Within a year or so after I started my company, I moved on from the lab position to go full time at my company called Regional Earth System Predictability Research. This business is about developing cutting edge weather and climate products and solutions and services based on those solutions. I'm glad I moved on from my lab position because I got to do a lot of things without any limitations as far as my pursuit of research. And in the process, of course, became the Stalker method, which is now known as for computational fluid dynamics and numerical weather prediction modeling. And I've used this method and implemented it into the RESPER model at my first company. And over the years, of course, things have been up and down, as any entrepreneur could relate to. I have had my share of them, but I stuck with my plans and made my vision bigger and better, and also evolved as a person myself, which I will get into a little bit later on. But so the main point being really is being an entrepreneur is quite challenging, but there are some things that we could do to overcome those challenges and the stress and all of that. I would be talking about that a little bit later in when I discuss my 9 entrepreneurship fundamentals. So one of the companies, the weather climate simulation technology efforts, really go back to my days in graduate school at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I was a student in mechanical engineering pursuing this field of computational fluid dynamics. I wasn't really thinking about weather or climate at that point, purely a systems thinker trying to understand what the challenges or limitations are of the science. And after my master's degree in mechanical engineering, I moved on to get a PhD and a master's in atmospheric sciences at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. After that, I moved on to work at Los Alamos National Lab for a number of years before I started my company. So I want to describe this journey as far as the Stalker method being all the way back in the early 90s in the computational fluid dynamics area, and then on to the weather atmospheric science education pursuits at the university. So one of the things that was nagging at me for the longest time was the amount of information that we obtain and use for our back period analysis or forecasting. The type of measurements that we make are for what I call state variables, although it's not mysterious, everybody knows what they are, such as wind speed, temperature, relative humidity, pressure, and a host of other variables. But we measure them because from those measurements, we will increase our understanding as far as whether the weather is warming or cooling or where it is, and in the forecast too, similarly, whether it's going to be a warmer day, a cooler day, or is it going to rain or snow, those types of things that we want to understand, which is really important. But in the scientific world, the deficiency is that you cannot measure these state variables and get the understanding that you need to estimate state variables at other locations where we have no measurements. And unfortunately, the data gaps for the past periods up to current time are more than 90%, which is kind of shocking to a lot of people. But because of my research and the background in that computational fluid dynamics area, I figured out that that's the huge gap there. If we're only relying on state variable measurements and extrapolating or interpolating them to the locations where we have no measurements. So our sophisticated measurement platforms have been around and they have increased a lot. I'm not belittling anything that has been done. That's great, but it's still not going to move the data needle from the 10% to 80% or 90%. So one of the findings from my research efforts over the years is these state variables actually are shaped constantly on a minute by minute basis or hour by hour basis based on the underlying physical processes that are changing all the time and also interacting, more importantly. And those changes and the interactions have to be accounted for in order to be able to get better analysis for the past or for forecasting. So one point I would make here is no matter how sophisticated we get as far as our measuring capabilities are, we're not going to be able to measure the future in the form of forecasting. So we do have to resort to models, and those have been around and we still use them, but the deficiencies that I found in those models in terms of their ability to capture these underlying physical processes is really one of the main points that the Stalker method is built on, and it's implemented into the RESPER platform. So we want to use this platform to offer these cutting-edge solutions to all of the states and all of the players within those states, any number of industrial sectors, and then do it for all countries also globally and over the oceans where we have no clear customers, but they have to be taken into account also if you want to get at the climate change more accurately, quantitatively, and more robustly. And that's what this technology allows us to do. And without doing that, of course, our guesswork about what the climate change might be is just that, guessing based on the limited amount of information that we have, and also the deficient models that try to fill those large data gaps. And by doing so, we are incorporating a lot of the bias, which is not good when it comes to climate change and the quantification of it. But more importantly, when we take any measures to mitigate that climate change, for example, to keep the global warming level to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, how do you do that? Using the current science, that's not possible because you don't know what the mitigating measures that you're taking would do to the system. We're unable to quantify that using the current science. And that's why the Stalker method and the method implemented into the RESPER model becomes indispensable. So that's something that I want to talk about. I want to share that with you folks, why this is so important to do globally before we resolve this problem and also better ourselves going forward. So I just want to kind of take a break from the weather climate simulation technology that I just discussed in not so greater detail, scientifically speaking, because I really don't want to introduce the jargon, but I'm sure there is a lot of information that you can find from me There are websites that I will be listing at the end of this presentation, and you can always get a hold of me. So the second technology that I also am developing, and I received a patent for, US patent several years ago, is the load creating renewable energy technologies. As a matter of fact, this technology is about consumption, not generation. So it's generation agnostic, but it consumes energy on site, so we don't have to have the transmission lines to put the energy into the grid, so the consumers are using the energy on the other end. So instead of doing that, traditionally what people do, I'm bringing load to the generation through this technology. And that's exactly what this technology would do. And here is how I create, or my technology concept would create by bringing the load to the generation. So a lot of us, we all know we're using laptops, workstations, even cell phones that we charge several times a day, depending on our usage. They're all using energy from the grid supplied energy. We don't know what the source might be. Usually a mix of things, most likely fossil fuel energy, but all of that energy used on the consumer end don't have to be used on the consumer end for these computers. So what I have come up with within my patent and some of the claims are that I could offset the use of energy on the consumer end by a lot. I'm thinking more like over 90%. And that energy is going to be consumed at the generation side, where I may be employing a hybrid system like wind and solar combination. And then our consumers are going to have a connection device which is going to use much smaller energy on the consumer end, while the rest of the computers are using bulk of the energy at the generation side. And they will have to have reliable connection, internet connectivity on their end to be able to use this technology properly, more efficiently. But as we all know that the internet connectivity is getting better, even globally in remote locations through satellites and other technologies. And we're going to be able to utilize all of them to give the computing power that everyone needs globally, but without having to draw that energy from the grid. So that's really how I would describe the load creating renewable energy technology that I'm also developing. There is a connection to my weather climate simulation technology to the renewable energy technology too. I want to briefly mention. When we select sites for these projects, we don't have to rely on a few years of data at sparse locations and heights like in wind projects that people do. Instead, we're going to create 30 years of data as if we measured wind speed and solar radiation across the entire domain of interest for the design. And then using that robust data sets, we're going to be able to create a highly efficient project. And then when they come online after being built, we are going to also use the same technologies capabilities for forecasting, whether that's a day ahead, hour ahead, or even up to 6 months in advance, or even longer. So those are the kinds of things the first technology allows us to do to augment and support the second technology. So we're going to do that as well through this the second technology, the renewable energy technology that's being developed within my other company called Smart Energy Load Centers. So Now I want to just kind of break off from the technology discussions to my 9 entrepreneurship fundamentals. Now I'm more excited about my fundamentals and also the leading concept that I'm developing for organizational excellence, more so than the technology development efforts that I got involved in over the years. And the reason for that is this: even if you're successful financially as an entrepreneur, if your fundamentals are not solid, which they are not, including myself, which I had to learn over the years, although I was employing them bits and pieces without proper framework. So I had to kind of sit down and think through and why I'm doing this and all of that. That occurred in 2018, I would say after 16 years. So it took a long time, even though I was practicing them individually, but not as a framework. So here is the framework that I developed. I hope some of you like them and get inspired. And I intend to have a virtual booth to discuss those and the technology solutions also further. But, and there are these. You need to have a purpose, well defined. That's the first fundamental. And I encourage, highly encourage you guys to write down your purpose on a piece of paper, whether you use 4 words, 5 words, or 8 words. Make it as short as possible, but also meaningful. And then vision. What do you want to take your company to in the next 5 years? Whether that's in terms of revenue, or number of clients you served, or number of people you taught, whatever the case might be. The number, along with the timeline, should be your vision. So vision has been talked about. Everybody knows it's usually abstract, but I want it to be concrete, like what I'm talking about here. So, and then the third fundamental for the entrepreneurship development is pathways that you need to define to realize your vision in line with the purpose. So if you end up doing something that's not in line with your purpose, that's really not good. You really need to rethink and realign yourself. And that's why the possibilities of your pathways would get a few and a few. They're not thousands or tens of thousands of possibilities, because they're restricted by your purpose and then your vision. So your pathways are only a few. In my case, it's really down to reaching out to the country governments and state governments in the US for the first technology, and tens of thousands of universities and other educational institutions across the globe. That's for the second technology. But I can build upon those relations once I have those 2 pathways set for us. So the fourth fundamental for this entrepreneurship success framework is a recipe for success. So as an entrepreneur, you may start as one person doing a lot of things, but at some point you will grow. You will have a team doing various things, supporting your vision and your pathways, and in alignment with your purpose. And that recipe has to reflect on what your company does. So I would say the recipe for success should be reflected in 3 different buckets of human resources. And in my case, I say 3 buckets are business development bucket, technology development bucket, and finance development bucket. So how many people are working within those will reflect on the type of business you have. For example, in my case, the Enterprise Universe, which is my global brand, which is really holding the two companies that I already introduced, Resper and Celsi technology companies. So when you look at my human resources, they will be falling into these three buckets with 50 people out of 100 going into the technology development bucket because it's a technology heavy landscape. And then 30 of the 100 would fall into the business development bucket because I do want to emphasize developing and nurturing those relations with our clients, not only in the US but globally. So that would leave about 20% in the finance development bucket because finance is a key thing, key ingredient for all of us entrepreneurs. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it has to be timely. So you have to pay attention to those resources as well. So in my case, it's 50 technology, 30 business development, and 20 finance. It might be quite different for some of you, depending on the type of business you're developing, but you still need to have that recipe for success. So the fifth fundamental is about knowing yourself and what I call know thyself. Because as the entrepreneur that's developing these really cool technologies and putting teams together for the recipe for success, but if you are not able to mold yourself into the right type of a mindset to support the purpose that you have, the vision that you are pursuing, and the pathways you're on, you really have to constantly develop yourself, refine yourself. And that's why know thyself is such an important fundamental that I also throw in. Those are the first 5 of the 9. Kind of reflects on, where you need to start and how you solidify them and make them work together and gel together. It's a lot of work. They look like simple ideas, maybe even look like a word salad, but they're really, really tough to implement. Very, very time consuming. But it's worth it because in the end, when you become a successful business person, you may have all of the financial resources that you are seeking, but it won't be rewarding. You don't want to be miserable in the end. And that's why these fundamentals are so important. So now I'll get into what I call back 4. And these are outward looking and very important too. And those are how you treat your customers. It's a very important thing as an entrepreneur. If you don't have those skills, you have to develop those skills. Because without developing those skills, you're not going to be able to succeed. So respecting your customers is one of the important things that you will ever learn or ever have to learn as an entrepreneur. A lot of us are not taught about that. It's definitely not myself. As an analytical scientist, maybe top-notch scientist, I didn't really have to pay attention to that. But as a businessman that jumped into the entrepreneurship ocean with 2 feet first, I had to learn that. So I'm telling you from my experience, you really have to develop that respect and caring for your customer. Everything that you do as an entrepreneur and your team is really all about making your customer lives better. It's really not about making money. That's more of a byproduct. So that's why I throw customers as a fundamental that every entrepreneur will have to master to be able to succeed in the entrepreneurship world. And beyond that, the next fundamental is the 7th fundamental, which is really how you treat people. Whether your spouses, kids, your parents, grandparents, your neighbors, your community, and your country, and the rest of the world. now you have the ability to treat people because you learn from the customer's fundamental I just talked about. And you just have to translate that, repeat that with everyone else. Who knows? They might be your next customer. So you're essentially transforming yourself into a better person. In my case, I actually go a little further. Just be kind uh, to everyone because that's really what it's all about. So we're talking about humanity and then kindness. Don't have to be cutthroat, a jerk to become a better entrepreneur. There are lots of folks out there that practice that, but it's really self-defeating in the end. So I would say the people fundamental is really as important as the customer fundamental too, where you learn the behavior if you don't have it already, uh, while treating your customers better, and then translate that. Use the same behavior that you learned. Now, hopefully, you didn't have to learn, you already had it, but a lot of folks don't. Then you're treating your fellow human beings kindly. So the next fundamental is what I call learning. This is organizational, different than the know thyself fundamental that I introduced early on. So this is about learning as an organization. So you really have to harp on that a lot when you bring some folks into your orbit. They are fully on board with your fundamentals, right from the purpose all the way down to competitors. I will talk next. So when you are learning as an organization, you're going to get better. You're going to get better in refining your purpose and everything else. So the last fundamental of the 9 that I have come up with as a framework for solidifying yourself as a successful entrepreneur, not just for money or financial gain, is competitors, how you treat competitors. So this is really kind of goes against the normal behavior that we show toward competitors. It's really from the I win, you lose, or you and I lose kind of attitude that we have developed, and we kind of use that in our daily lives as entrepreneurs. But it's really destructive because competitors, to me, are future strategic partners. You just don't know them yet. So you need to really develop that attitude toward competitors, because here is the reason. If the competitors and yourself are in the same business of helping your customers with their needs and making their lives better, then you're on the same team. You're not on a different team. You're on the same team, and that's why you're working together. It's just that you haven't found a way to do that. And I'm asking you folks as entrepreneurs to bake that into your DNA of your company. Make sure all of your team members, employees, they all know what you're about. So that tops off the 9 fundamentals that I talked about briefly. And as I said before, I will be having a virtual booth to go over some of these details, and I'll be available afterwards too. It's just a matter of time. But in closing, I want to say that being an entrepreneur is probably the best thing that one can do. So I'm biased, but having been in the academic world for a long time and also in the public sector, being a government employee at the lab, and in the private sector for the longest time, since 2002. I learned that being an entrepreneur is probably the best thing that you could do, but you have to be a better person. So your impact is also meaningful, not only to you, but to your customers and your employees and everyone else that you come across and deal with, your community, your society, and the world at large. So that's what I want to emphasize and leave you with, but I'll briefly touch on what I talked about. The weather climate simulation technology is really cutting edge for global application, indispensable for climate change, and the mitigation strategies we want to seriously take. Without that, you cannot actually address it. So that's one. And the load creating technology, renewable energy technology is also for global application. And it's going to eliminate a lot of the losses that we tend to incur, and the infrastructure investments that have to be made to beef up capacity on the available transmission or new lines. This is going to actually minimize, not eliminate completely, but minimize those types of investments and the impact on the environment. So see the way I do things as a systems thinker. I connect all of them. Nothing goes off from the other efforts I do. So I'm looking at cryptocurrency, for example, to bring it into the enterprise universe, the global brand. It's going to have similar connections to the climate change and the environmental impact and things like that. I hope my story has given you some thoughts about being a good entrepreneur and how today's struggle is going to turn into tomorrow's success. You just have to keep at it. And I hope to see some of you in the virtual booth. Thank you for your attention.